the pleasure and the honor to declare open the fourth edition of the Supranational Democracy Dialogue. This is an initiative we started in 2018, an initiative by Università del Salento, and for the first time, this is in Brindisi, for the first, and I hope not for the last, as Brindisi is getting more and more important in the geography of Università del Salento. And before I introduce the topic, I want to leave the floor to the Mayor of Brindisi, thanking him for being with us. And so, Riccardo Rossi, you have the floor, thank you.
Grazie, buongiorno e benvenuti a Brindisi a tutti e a tutti. Io innanzitutto vi porgo i miei saluti, i saluti della città. Grazie all'Università del Salento per l'iniziativa e soprattutto per la collaborazione che con l'Università del Salento la città di Brindisi ha stretto in particolare negli ultimi anni con l'apertura di nuovi corsi di laurea e in particolare uno molto attinente anche al tema della 2 giorni che si terrà qui a Brindisi, proprio sulla cooperazione internazionale e lo sviluppo. Brindisi è una città, ecco, dico 2 cose, Brindisi è una città che ha oltre 2000 anni di storia e quindi è stata crocevia in questa grandissima e lunghissima storia di popoli, di genti, attraverso la Via Appia, la Valigia delle Indie e poi ultimamente anche da qualche anno, circa 20 anni, ospita anche un'importante base ONU che è al centro ovviamente di tutti gli scenari di crisi internazionali che sono aperti nel mondo. Da qui partono sia attraverso la base ONU che attraverso l'agenzia del World Food Program moltissime missioni e fanno riferimento appunto a moltissime missioni internazionali. Da questo contesto è nata anche l'idea di aprire qui a Brindisi un corso di laurea di cooperazione internazionale proprio perché c'è già una grande esperienza in questo senso e Brindisi può diventare anche un luogo di formazione di tutti gli operatori, tutte le persone che lavorano nell'ambito della cooperazione internazionale. Dico questo per dire che ovviamente il tema della democrazia europea, quindi il tema dei rapporti fra gli Stati nazionali è un tema nel quale ovviamente poi si riflettono anche tutte queste iniziative che si realizzano a Brindisi e diventa, diciamo, sempre più attuale anche in funzione di questa guerra, crisi che si è aperta ormai, se non erro, il 24 di febbraio, la Russia invade l'Ucraina, questa guerra e apre anche una discussione all'interno della stessa Europa sull'atteggiamento che l'Europa e le prospettive che l'Europa deve dare di fronte a una crisi, una guerra devastante come quella a cui stiamo assistendo. E dobbiamo dire che probabilmente, almeno a mio avviso, da non addetto ai lavori, nel senso che non sono ovviamente un esperto di relazioni internazionali fra gli Stati, mi sembra che la risposta europea sia abbastanza frammentata. L'Europa non stia giocando in questo momento il ruolo che le dovrebbe spettare perché ovviamente lo scenario di guerra è in Europa e molti paesi hanno idee e visioni sul tema anche molto differenti fra loro. Quindi probabilmente un modello di democrazia europea maggiormente definito da un punto di vista anche di ordinamento giuridico, legale, probabilmente dovrebbe aiutare anche a dare delle risposte comuni e consentire all'Europa di essere non solo un mercato europeo, non solo avere una dimensione economica, finanziaria, ma anche una dimensione più politica, nel momento in cui all'interno di questa guerra penso che si stiano giocando non solo purtroppo sulla vita delle persone, del popolo ucraino, anche una revisione, no, degli assetti geopolitici mondiali, perché sono tutti coinvolti, dalla Russia alla Cina, dagli Stati Uniti, e l'Europa mi sembra che abbia un ruolo un po' secondario, soprattutto perché non riesce a dare risposte univoche e aprire trattative di pace e gestirle in maniera opportuna. Poi ognuno avrà giustamente le proprie idee su quelle che dovrebbero essere le soluzioni, i modelli da adottare in questa crisi. Però mi sembra che manca il luogo di confronto e che gli Stati europei vadano un po' in ordine sparso. Ne parlavo un po' prima, chiacchierando prima dell'inizio, mi sembra anche che l'Europa rischia, nel suo assetto politico, anche di essere condizionata dalle contingenze delle singole elezioni. Abbiamo visto quello che è successo in Francia, in cui il dibattito fra Macron o la Le Pen era un dibattito che era una elezione che avrebbe avuto risvolti anche sugli assetti europei. Allora io penso che questo manifesti la difficoltà dell'Europa di avere un assetto maggiormente consolidato da un punto di vista di assetti istituzionali, di governo democratico dell'Europa, e che non possa essere messo a rischio o vivere le contingenze dell'elezione politica di uno dei 4, 5, 6 stati maggiori, perché questo significa che ogni anno, ogni 2 anni, siccome nei vari paesi europei ogni anno tra Spagna, Francia, Germania, Italia si andrà alle elezioni, questo significa dover riconfigurare la politica economica, la politica estera, la politica, tutte le varie politiche in funzione degli esiti delle elezioni di uno dei singoli Stati. Questo rappresenta evidentemente una cosa che non può succedere ad esempio negli Stati Uniti, con gli Stati federali, ma né in Germania, che ha un modello federale, ma se l'Europa deve fare un passo avanti da un punto di vista di organizzazione politica, dovrebbe avere un modello che non può essere ridiscusso della contingenza delle singole elezioni, e lo vedremo l'anno prossimo in Italia, dove anche qui tra gli schieramenti politici ci sono idee molto contrastanti su quella che deve essere l'Europa e su quello che deve essere il rapporto del singolo Stato, cioè dell'Italia, nei confronti dell'architettura europea. Quindi penso che questa discussione possa essere uno spunto, perché ovviamente da un ambiente anche accademico possano e debbano nascere delle proposte che consolidano l'esperienza di questi 60 anni ormai, no? Di quasi 70, dalla comunità dell'acciaio e del carbone fino all'attuale assetto europeo, ma molti passi in avanti devono essere ancora fatti proprio sull'ordinamento politico e democratico dell'Europa. Quindi io vi auguro veramente buon lavoro su temi che sono cruciali e che poi riguarderanno, no, la vita delle singole persone, hanno ricadute fondamentali sugli assetti del Paese, ma anche, ripeto, sulla vita di tutti noi. Grazie e buon lavoro.
Grazie Sindaco, speriamo di rivederla più tardi, comunque saremo felici di averla con noi per tutto il tempo che vorrà. I have the pleasure now to give the floor to Professor Mariano Longo, Director of the Department of History, Society and Human Studies. I don't know if I translate well the title of the department. And we are lucky to have him here because the course in Sciences for International Cooperation started this year in the city of Brindisi is part of this department. So thank you for being here. Mario, you have the floor.
It's actually a pleasure. I don't know whether I should speak English. I speak some English anyway, or Italian. English, okay, as you prefer. So a couple of ideas, scattered ideas actually about the topic, which is fascinating: democracy, globalization, national state and global processes. That's the way I reward actually the title of this very interesting meeting. The first idea, which I was wondering about actually driving all the way from Lecce to Brindisi, was that we are witnessing, the mayor was actually talking about that, a crisis of the idea which was typical of the monolithic globalization thought, according to which all the processes were going to become global. Actually, we're witnessing, even in the war context which we're experiencing now, the fact that the national state is becoming once again more and more important. This is the first thought which I actually wanted to share with the audience. The second consideration is about the idea of democracy. Is it possible to translate democracy, which was actually the way the national state in Western countries organized actually political activity as a global concept, able to influence global solution to global problems, actually, which is rewarding of the subtitle of this interesting conference. This is actually a problem because we thought that democracy could be exported. Actually, it is one of the ways in which we organize in Western countries political decision. It's not the only way. Probably it is the best way, but it is not the only one. So the challenges we are experiencing are quite a lot, actually, and I welcome the organization of this very interesting meeting because in the organization of the meeting, all these topics are object of discussion, not only among scholars, but also among members of what we call civic society, which is also a very important element in the discussion. So I don't want to speak too much. I am used to speak little in few occasions, and the idea was to come in a place which is a very wonderful one, Brindisi, in this wonderful venue, which is, I didn't actually know this wonderful building, this castle in Brindisi, because I find it very important to stress the relevance of international cooperation, of our degree course, and of all the activities which foster the fact that University of Salento is actually a combination of places and spaces in which Brindisi is one of the most relevant location, actually. So I thank you very much indeed. My greetings are actually also on behalf of my rector, Professor Pollic, who was not able to come because he's got many things to do, actually. He's much more busy than I am. So it's the greeting of the University of Salento, and I wish you a successful two-day meeting. Thanks a lot.
Grazie Mario. Yes, potete accomodarvi nella prima fila. I invite here Arian and Catherine, if you want to join me at the table. We have discussed with Wolfgang that as he will talk about the global dimension, we will focus best before on the European dimension, and then we will move towards the global. So, yes, I will say a few words to introduce the topic as the topic of the conference, not only the topic of the session. The idea behind this initiative comes from afar, and the nature of European democracy has been discussed for more than 70 years, I think, and I could say even more than a century, because even before creating the European communities, there was a debate about which was the best way to unite Europe, and some forward thinkers were already imagining some kind of European, not only integration, but I would say democracy, because these were mostly federalists, so they imagined the democratic asset of Europe. Now is apparently is not the moment, many people would say it's not the moment to talk about democracy, Europe, because we have a war at our border. But when people tell me this, my usual reaction, I don't know if it's just my reaction, is to say this is exactly the moment. So I see that Ariane agrees. Because Altiero Spinelli wrote the Manifesto di Ventotene in 1941 in the middle of the Second World War. When there was absolutely a dissolution of half of European states and a dominance of fascist and Nazi vision around Europe. So it was there in the worst of the moment that he dared to imagine, together with Ernesto Rossi, Alberto Coroni, a completely different Europe. So I think it's in bad times that we have to make an effort of imagination and imagine better times. So this supranational democracy dialogue is the idea to go a bit beyond the European dimension, but bringing at the core the European experience. Because we live in an age of global issues. Most of the issues are currently global. Just think about the climate problem, but the loss of biodiversity, the deforestation, the pollution of oceans. These are all global issues, but there are also issues related to humans, more to the human dimension, such as peace and security, inequalities, migration waves. So national states become more and more too small to deal with them. And so the point is we want really to give more power to the existing global institutions. We can accept as the right or the best fora to discuss these emergencies, the current global institutions, the UN, the G20, as they are. I'm sure in this room we think no. And the UN just proved quite ineffective in dealing with the war in Ukraine. So it's clear that the solution is not already there. The solution has to be invented or created or reformed. And this conference was created as a place for creativity to show up, so as a place to mix academia with civil society and with thinkers outside academia, just to sparkle new ideas, because I think democracy is a solution, but democracy may take many different shapes according to the dimensions. For sure, the democracy known by the ancient Greeks is something completely different from the democracy that we saw at the creation of the United States of America or at the democracy we have now. And for the current standards, the previous democracies maybe were not democracies at all, because we had slavery, we had women outside the room. We had very different features. So democracy is an evolving concept. And so point is how we can reimagine democracy, not only with the values and the rights that we consider at the core of our understanding now, but fitting for the global dimension, which is really challenging. And but before we get there, I have to say that I've spoke with many scholars outside Europe, and they told me, many of them told me, that Europe is quite a lab also for them. They consider Europe, as European Union is actually the only democracy beyond the state, even with all its limits. It's a place where we elect a parliament, it's a place where we go to a judge if we need justice, it's a place where we have democracy participatory tools like online consultations, online citizens initiative, this kind of stuff. So may not be the perfect democracy, but it's a democracy nonetheless. Maybe more than some states are, actually. And so it's often considered a lab where new things are experimented, and actually the Conference on the Future of Europe is one of these experimental things going on. And I agree with the Major when he says we are not there already, but we are quite on a way forward. Comparing to the original features of the European community, we moved quite forward in the last 50 years, I think. And it was a very beautiful surprise for us Italians to hear 2 days ago our head of government in the European Parliament saying that we need federalism. It's the first time that one of the heads of government of an important country used these words in the European Parliament. So maybe things are changing. And so we are here to talk about Europe, about the world, about what can imagine beyond the state as democracy. And I'm happy to welcome here many very interesting speakers and experts from many different countries. And I have already 2 at this table. So I'm happy to give the floor now to Arjan van der Waal. I don't know if I pronounce it well. From the European Democracy Lab in Berlin. And please, Arjan, you have the floor. If you want to say a few words about the European Democracy Lab as well, so everybody knows.
Definitely. Thank you very much, Susanna. Thank you for inviting us here. It's really great to be here. Before I explain, can I first see a show of hands? Who of you have been active, maybe even as a citizen in this new supranational democratic European initiative, this conference on the future of Europe? As citizens or as professionals? As a citizen. Fantastic, that's already quite a lot. And who of you have been following from afar? A few more. That's really great, so that's quite a lot. I see very few hands in the back of the room. I don't know how that is being translating. You know, front of the room has been participating actively, back of the room has not been that involved. But it is indeed, you know, as Susanna said, it is this latest initiative. I was fortunate enough to attend one of the sessions, the Citizens Panel number 4 in Maastricht, as an observer. I met there like all sorts of Europeans, a teacher from Portugal, a sales manager from Sweden, a retiree from Bulgaria, an accounts manager from Ireland, and also Jean-Luc. Jean-Luc is from France. He's a plumber at the end of his career. And we met at the queue for the coffee, and he introduced himself as a Euroscepticist, as a racist, actually. A Euroscepticist and a racist at the Conference of Europe. Well, that's Jean-Luc. My name is Arjan van der Waal. I'm a fellow at the European Democracy Lab. I've 25 years of experience of being active in democratic governance on 3 different continents, lived and worked in 7 different countries. We as a lab, we combine academia, activism and arts to try and blow more imagination in the thinking about that democratic future of Europe. We use a gimmick, a leitmotif, as we say. That's the European Republic. The European Republic. We put that as a dot on the horizon, and then as a lab, we go and experiment and play. Well, where to start? Maybe with that bleak picture of democracy, because there's hope and we want to project on the future, but honestly the situation at present is not good. We see independent press being closed down in Hungary, the universities being closed there. You see the judiciary in Poland being held in a stranglehold. You see political party systems really imploding, like in France. You see voters going really for the extremes of the political spectrum. I think you know this in Italy, you see it in France, in my native, the Netherlands too. It looks really bleak. The democratic systems as they are, they seem to be fading. And the problem is, we don't see that recreated or reclaimed at the European level. If you look at Europe and the European system, it's equally bleak. It is not delivering. Both, I think, you as professionals, but also a citizen, sees very clearly and feels that Europe at the supranational level is not taking the model of a democracy. You spoke about parliament, Susanna, but honestly, you can vote for this European Parliament, but it is really post-democratic. You can vote, but actually you don't have a choice. It also doesn't work like a parliament. It doesn't have right of initiative. It doesn't have budgetary rights, or very flimsy. Then you have the European Commission. It's actually really not a government. It's actually the guardian of the treaties. Guardian of treaties, but is treaties, the law, is that not supposed to be guarded by the judiciary, by a court? Then you have the European Council, this big beast with way too much power. It's really out of balance. It's always playing the national card. When I hear my Prime Minister from the Netherlands coming back from Brussels, he's always talking about Dutch interest and what's good for the Dutch. He's never talking about Europeans. So intuitively, and I think also as a professional, you can say it looks like a democracy, but it's certainly not a democracy. And citizens intuitively, they feel that. And they know that. So where that's really problematic if you consider that democracy is one of the fundamental values that we are not living up to, one of the fundamental values in the EU that we're not living up to. It looks like governance for all, but there is no responsibility and no accountability to all. You can't get control. Those Brexiteers had a point. What we think at the lab as the crucial issue is that basically we have been foregoing one of the basic lessons of the social contract, Locke and Rousseau. We have been forgetting about who is actually the sovereign here in Europe. And that should be the citizen. The citizen should be the central player at our European political system. And that's really something that is not being happening. For the last decades, when we've been talking about sovereignty in Europe, it was about who? It was about, is it more the EU that should have more the sovereignty, or is it the member states, the nation states? And that has been a huge mistake. So the citizens have been losing out. We should put them back as the sovereigns of the political system in Europe. That's what we think. How do you do that? How do you do that? Actually, in a way, it is a very simple move that you need to make. European citizenship at the moment is fully incomplete. European citizens, in terms of their citizenship, where are they citizens? They are actually only there as consumers, so there's a tiny part of your identity as a European, and as a traveler. So as consumer and as a traveler, you are a European citizenship. But if you look at, for example, Rosan Vion, Le Sacre du Citoyen, what is actually the core and what makes your citizenship full? It's free rights that need to be equal. So equality of rights in front of the law is the essence of being a citizen and also a European citizen. So we'll get there if we give European citizens equality of rights, three different issues. Politically, so equality when you're voting. At the moment, we're not voting equally for the European Parliament. Voting equally. Same as for taxation, that's the second aspect. Taxations, which will lead in a democracy to representation and vice versa. And the third part is access to social rights. Once we convey on Europeans equal rights, all Europeans, on these three areas, politically, taxation-wise and socially, that's when we'll end up with full citizenship. And what do Europeans do when they actually want to unite in one political body as full citizens? What have they been doing for centuries? What have we been doing in Europe for already tens and tens of times? We create a republic, a normative unity. And that's indeed, what Europe has always been meant to be. That's what we have been told. We're supposed to be one, united in diversity. So the essence is that we should move to normative unity, equal before the law in these three essential areas, and then we can be as diverse as we want to be in terms of culture. So that's the essential move to make. Citizens at the core, equal rights, the right rights, not just as consumers and as travelers, as full citizens, equality before the law. And we end up, if we take that one political body, with a European Republic. Now, is this about centralism, one big major, another major superstate? No, it is definitely not. We should really reinvent and redesign what that Europe should look like. It will have to be horizontal. It will have to be a network, and here comes Monet in place, that's being integrated economically, socially, and the units will have to be a lot smaller than they are today. It will have to be a network of metropoles, the cities, and the regions that we have. So we're looking at a Europe where citizens at the core, equality of rights, so normative unity, and a diversity of interconnected, borderless, so connected, units at the base. Cities, metropoles, and regions. That's what we look at. When we look at, because I actually did look beyond Europe, when you look at globalization, is that possible? And this is where I think it becomes interesting. This is a political project, obviously. You don't actually realize political projects by what we're doing today, coming together, network, knitting, and so forth. We can knit and go on with conferences and so forth. It won't happen, not with the powers that be. What you do when you have a political project, you need to put a dot on the horizon. Let it be in 10 years, let it be in 2045, let it be in 2050, and you make it concrete, and that's when you work there. So is this feasible? If we want to go to this supranational democracy in Europe, that's what we'll have to do. That's what we try and do as a lab as well. Put the dot on the horizon. If we want to get there, what would it look like? And we slowly work towards. We have, of course, already a very interesting precedent in the euro, which was designed in '72. The dot on the horizon in the end was 2002. And we arrived there, even if by the time it was decided, late 80s, early 90s, no one was in favor. No one knew how it was going to happen. So in terms of feasibility, it's a matter of putting that dot on the horizon, deciding as those citizens together, this is where we want to get to, and then we'll move there. This is scalable. So what I just said, that's a big question. This new form, this decomposed form of state, that horizontal connection at the basis, is this something that can go beyond Europe? If you look at the current dynamics at global stage with this new bipolar or unipolar outlook, then you'll see where the spaces will be. Those who are being squeezed, like we are probably between the America and the US and China. And you can see where the other spaces are, where people will be looking for such a perspective and such a dot on the horizon as well. The first part I'm thinking of is the African continent. So let me maybe wrap up here and say, so the democratic deficit, it is there. Democracy is fading. We'll need to reach a real paradigm shift. We need to change our focus away and put the citizen as a sovereign at the core again. How will that come about? It is this equal rights before the law on these three essential areas, politically, taxation, and socially. Is it feasible? It will be difficult. Today with the member states, in power, that is not going to happen today. We will need a dot on the horizon to get there and chart that way together, as we can do in these days, in these conversations. Let me then take you back quickly about feasibility to Jean-Luc, the plumber that I met in Maastricht at the coffee machine, who declared himself an Eurosceptic and a racist. What he said to me was, look, I don't know what's happening here. This is now my second session. He had already been in Strasbourg, and I think, well, in Strasbourg at least twice. And this is now my third session here. But it is really transformative. They put me down at the table with someone from Poland, with someone from Croatia. And really, these are the guys that I despised before. I hated them. This is why I was called a racist and a Eurosceptic. But now that they put me down here at the table, and they put this thing on my ears, and I can actually listen to them and hear what they say, and they can hear what I say, I cannot maintain my line of, this is not for me, I hate these guys, they are going to steal my job. I have to say and to admit that we are together. For me, Europe is actually now possible. So I would say, and close with that, and say, Viva la Repubblica Europea.
Thank you, Ariane. Now I have the pleasure to introduce Catherine Viadon. I think we will have the time at the end to have a round of comments and discussion. I agree on some things you said, and I agree less with some others, but that's fine, because that's what the dialogue is about. And Catherine is here from Brussels. She's both a scholar and an expert with an experience in this bad European Commission in several different roles. And she will tell maybe something more about that. We are very happy to have you here, Catherine. And she's here to talk about the linguistic rights and the multilingualism in the European Union. The presentation is already on the computer. I ask the technicians, scusate, possiamo mandare le slide sul video? Perfect.
Should I go there?
Yes, I think so.
I apologize. That's good. Grazie all'Università di Salento per l'invito. Sono molto felice di essere a Brindisi, veramente. È la prima volta che sono nelle Puglie. È un'opportunità e un piacere incontrare gente che cercano idee e soluzioni per vivere insieme meglio. A momento, I will go back to English, okay? Reacting to what you said, I say we're all frustrated activists and pro-Europeans. But today, with the war at our doors, after 60 years of peace, this is a time, this is a very special moment. And I think, in a way, this might not last, but this is, the stars are aligning today, okay? We have convergence of political leaders who believe we must take further steps urgently. We have been very slow, we have been inefficient. I entirely agree with that. We must still construct our sovereignty, but the stars are aligning and we cannot miss the opportunity, because the windows of opportunity are very often closing rapidly. So, and the challenges are huge. You mentioned the conference on the future of Europe. I took part in the exchanges, not direct, but you know, from afar with my group. I'm the Secretary General of a group, which is a section of the Union of European Federalists. So obviously I believe in federalism, I believe in regional integration, as a guarantor of equality and access of people, I mean social justice, political justice. And as you might be aware, 3 days ago, we had these conclusions of the conference, the plenary, where many ideas, very essential ideas, were validated. In particular, this idea that we need true European parties. I mean, we are working in a fragmented way, and this is making our system unreadable for the citizen. This is not efficient, this is not truly democratic. I'm not critical, but I think we must move on, and we need these transnational lists. And I believe we have a convergence at political level. Let's keep fingers crossed. Another major step that I won't mention all of them because climate and so on, is that we must get rid of unanimity. I have a little presentation that I will try to simplify as much as I can, but where I try to demonstrate how working with unanimous voting is not the right way to move forward. Whenever we make progress, we accept to share our sovereignty, and we accept to lose a little bit, but we regain so much more. And our this has to do with language rights, of course. But as regards unanimity, one of the key ideas of these conclusions of the Conference on the Future of Europe is that we must do away with unanimity in foreign policy. Obviously, we are being challenged. We are slow. We need a crisis, and other crises, we are slow, too slow, obviously. But the challenges are huge today, and we must be what I believe a truly sovereign region, region in the sense of a global region, a system which is democratic but also efficient and converging in its values and ready to defend its values. So I think there is hope, and the Parliament, the European Parliament, even though it does not have all the powers that I think it must have, validated these conclusions. So now is the fight. I mean, generally speaking, Europe is a fight, okay? It will take several generations. So we must accept, we have to fight. The next fight will be that. Can we convince the Council, and the European Council in particular, to surrender these national vetoes on the issue of defending our frontiers, supporting our neighbors, and establishing peace. We have been very inactive. We have been lazy. Now it's a wake-up call. We must stand up, support our neighbors, find open paths towards peace and democracy around us as well. Okay, I won't enter the details of this issue, but this will be one of the major issues. As regards democracy, transnational lists will be a major step, because at the moment we have national parties. This is not enough. We need more if we want what I believe should be a federal, sovereign, and democratic union. So much. Maybe I will, if Susanna allows me, briefly describe. I chose an issue which might sound a bit eccentric, but which is not at all, because language rights is one of these rights that allow citizens to be empowered, to be included, and a democracy to show it is inclusive. So I wanted to go back. Oh, how does that work? No, it's very...
If you need help, just ask.
Possibly. Sorry. Yes, I have. Maybe I will skip this. I was looking back to the history of a sectorial policy, which is justice. Okay, it's a very important topic at the moment, because Our values as regards justice are being challenged, as we'll know, in Poland, in Hungary. But this comes back to the times when we just did cooperation among member states. But we have moved on. Let's be optimistic. We made progress. Took time. But back in 1999, there was a summit, Tampere, in Finland. And the member states decided, okay, we can't continue this way, just cooperating. We need common standards. So if I make a long story, 10 years, short, I should say there were processes, green books, white papers, what have you. But in the end, and I'm going fast, we have the Lisbon Treaty where it was agreed that there would be minimal rules to guarantee the rights of individuals in cross-border criminal proceedings. Criminal justice was a hard topic where the member states said, we are sovereign, we don't want to surrender our sovereignty. But in the end, okay, we had a number of treaties. In the end, Lisbon does indeed take this further step. And yes, make what used to be cooperation mainstream European law. I'm a believer in the community method. I know you are legal experts here. I believe in a method where we integrate and where we have a common system to propose and then decide between the Parliament and the Council on a common basis, I mean on a par, being equal. We need the representatives of the citizens and we need the representatives of the member states to agree. This is a good system. This is inclusive and democratic. But it took a fight so that Lisbon in the end adopted a system of qualified majority and co-decision in criminal law, which meant that the Court of Justice was competent, that the member states had to implement, I will return to that, that the citizens, when involved in criminal proceedings, that is suspects, could invoke European law if the norms were not respected, and that's no small thing. I mean, it's not a common everyday situation, but it is a very important dimension of European integration. And part of that was a phenomenon that I believe is interesting. When the European Union took on board the norms and the standards, the values of the European Convention of Human Rights. This was a very important moment because, and I'm going very fast, international law is very important, and we all thank God that we have this European Court of Convention of Human Rights. The moment, however, when the European Union took these standards on board, it became something deeper, more consistent, because all the member states had to apply and implement equally in a similar way. And if they failed to do so, the guardian of European law, that is the Commission, could take them before the European Court of Justice. This is all taking place in a different area with Poland, with Hungary. But, okay, we have a guardian. It's good to have a guardian, no? So it was deeper. I mean, what I call deeper, more consistent, because all the member states must cooperate, and more effective, because this all goes down, reaching out to the citizen. Okay, in that particular situation of criminal law, that is, when you are a suspect, you can trust some norms, and I will give a little bit of detail, to be respected, especially when you are in a cross-border situation, which is where the Union, of course, is competent. National situations, I mean, the member states could deal with that. So this was, I think, a very important time, and that was the Lisbon Treaty. Why? Yes, this is what I'm trying to say. This has to do with things that are part of our common values, and has been there for centuries. This idea that every citizen has the right to a fair trial, that the rights of defense are some of our basic values. But this, again, was made part of European law in these cross-border situations that are becoming more and more common, possibly. So the member states had to do a number of things. Committing to values is a great thing, but committing to implement these values practically in an effective manner is, I think, one further step. So it meant that you had to provide, when you have somebody before justice, it's very good that a person understands, in a language one understands. It's a basic thing, but we all know of examples where a judge would say, well, you understand, huh? Okay. This is not exactly the proper standard that we aim at. So adequate language support was needed, like interpreters, and that was part of the Strasbourg Convention. Also translation, when you have translation, not of everything, but translation with a certain level of quality. I mean, this is taking things very seriously. It meant providing translators, interpreters, qualified interpreters. It meant the member states are expected to create registers of qualified language experts in legal proceedings, in judicial proceedings. So that's ambitious. It's not easy, and it's costly, as we all know. Language is okay. If you want to cross languages, you have to bear the costs. So not all the member states were enthusiastic, but they are committed to doing it. And of course, there was an issue of training these legal experts, judges, magistrates, lawyers, to make them understand what it means to be in a cross-border situation and what it means to work. To work with differences. I'm quoting a French philosopher there. Working with cultural differences. You have experts, you have interpreters, you have language experts, and these guys, you must find working methods with them. They're not just obedient, translators of the letter of the law, and they have to give the essence of the difference. So very rapidly, I apologize, this is all about effective and efficient communication that I think we are aiming at. I'm not saying it's perfect everywhere. No. But in case you do have a problem, you can go to court, even to the European Court of Justice. Okay. So this idea that you need to speak and to understand, in case you are not in that position, in case the conditions are not provided, you have a right to challenge, you have a right to have the essential documents translated, various solutions, oral translation, a summary, if you agree to it. So, more protective. Quality also is another issue. It's another obligation. The member states must ensure quality. Very ambitious, I agree. But still, the standards must be right. And if the quality is found deficient, you have a right to complain. And I mentioned registers. So this is a very specific area. But I mean, coming from where we were before the Treaty of Maastricht to the latest state of the treaties, Lisbon, I think we made good progress in terms of preserving the rights of people in cross-border proceedings, criminal in particular. And just, perhaps I will finish on that very famous quotation, we do not federate states, we unite human beings. It's part of the promises, the initial promises of the whole European construction. It's still there, and we're working into it. And this is where I put languages and where I'm tried to draw up and see how the machine can work. And the machine can work if there is a linguistic regime in the institutions which is attached and to the rights of the citizens to access, to write to the institution, to express their opinions on draft policies. And this is part of the consultation process. And even to interact among each other. And this is the conference on the future of Europe, which is really another of these laboratories, which I hope will be extended in some form or another in the future, repeated, where citizens could contribute in their own language. Okay, I'm not sure that the 475 million citizens contributed, but many people did, and it was possible to write and comment on what the others were saying on particular issues in your own language and get the translation. And this is where I think multilingualism is one of these solutions for an inclusive supranational democracy. So I hope the conference will bring major results for better policies and better organization at European level as a regional step towards global governance. But okay, let's, yeah, this is what I wanted to say very rapidly. So there is hope, but it takes a lot of work.
Yeah.
And it takes generations. So young people, welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. So now we switch at the table. I invite Wolfgang Pape and Amedeo Arena to come. Thank you for these brilliant contributions, and I think we will continue to talk about these topics. Take your time, don't worry. So, I have now the pleasure to give the floor to Wolfgang Pape, who is a former official of European Union with a long-standing experience as a diplomat of the Union in the External Action Service, and he is currently a researcher, a scholar in the think tank CEPS. And so with Wolfgang, we will have a very broad perspective from local to global. Thank you. You have the floor, Wolfgang.
Thank you very much. The first word should be my gratitude to you and your staff here. It's formidable what you prepared for us here at the conference. Thank you very much as well for your hospitality, already starting last night and today here in a very interesting, impressive environment to have this conference on the issues of supranationality, governance, democracy. Thank you very much as well to be so numerous here. I'm still looking for some young people. It was mentioned already we need the young people here, but we are all established, influential think tankers here, I imagine, so we have some influence in the world. And the world is what I, at the end, will come to, not to world governance, but to global governance. But I want to be systematic if I mention to get the slides going. Unfortunately not. Let me see if it works here. Neither. Sorry. I'm using all the buttons, but I can't make it. Neither the telecommander, no. No, doesn't work. Should I use here? Okay. It works there, but not there. As you see, I'm very much into visualization because I feel the spoken word is only one way to get to your senses, get into your brain. Visualization I learned in Asia. I am a little bit influenced by my studies in Japan in particular. And that's why I use even some Chinese characters here, because I feel the symbolic of Chinese characters and this kind of visualization can have some effect, even if you don't read it. Sometimes, if you're interested, I can explain it to you, what it really means. I'm starting talking about democracy and seeing the multi-level governance. In very simple terms, we start with the local level. Sorry. I have to get this straight. The local level here, the village. I wouldn't call Brindisi a village, but the mayor already explained how important it is. Bottom-up democracy starts at the local level. That's where even the Americans clearly say all politics are local. And I think this is very important to understand because that's where the citizens, as Arjan clearly said, are concerned. We have direct interests which are played out at local level. But it's not only the local level. We have on top of the local level, if you see the various multi-levels, the region or provinces, as they called in some countries, others call them regions. The problem with the word region in English in particular is it's being used subnational and supranational sometimes. So we call Europe the region in comparison to other major continents actually. But if you look at the word in different languages, region is being used very much as subnational within the nation as well. That's the complication. I use here the province. Unfortunately, the red doesn't come out very clearly. The province as a level subnational within the nation. There as well, we have issues of governance because there are several parliaments, even representative democracy plays out at all the levels here. But we always associate democracy, of course, with the nation. That still we have this Westphalian understanding of the sovereignty of where politics is played out nowadays. We see that in the wars, for instance. That's the most obvious case. And you might know from Max Weber that the actual identity of the nation state goes with this monopoly of violence. And this is a big issue. I don't want to discuss Russia, Ukraine, and all that, how far the nation is only a territorial issue. Is it more than that? Nation coming from native, natos in Latin. Obviously, there's more than just a territory. There's an identity which we overcome slowly within Europe, but it's very difficult to do. And if you look into history, actually, the idea of the nation was imposed by Europeans on the world. Extreme cases are the colonization. If you look at Africa, the borders are straight lines. These were straight lines which were more or less drawn by European, sometimes the British, sometimes the French, sometimes the Dutch, Portuguese, all these colonizers in the world actually drew borders, straight lines. It was a military result of fighting between different European nations worldwide. That's where the nation as an idea started. It's a very European concept. I looked a little bit into Chinese history, for instance. They never had this idea of a fixed territorial national identity. Even the Great Wall you might know of in China was actually not a national border, never. It was very flexible, and some of the Mongols made it all the way to Beijing even. So there are different understanding of the idea of the nation. It was very much a European concept imposed on the world. And I, as a European, dare say we have the responsibility now to overcome this kind of limited sovereignty, limited only to the nation as such. For me, it's a multi-level governance clearly shows that there are possibilities of competences. Even the monopoly of violence can be allocated to different levels. We have police, for instance, at all levels. You have the local police in some places. You have provincial police. You have national police, and we have Europol, for instance, with some competences, nevertheless. And there's even beyond that some Interpol and other organizations which have certain monopolies in their territory over the violence in case of course, violations of law, in case of even skirmishes within nations are part of this monopoly of violence that should be, my understanding, played out at different levels of governance. So the multi-level governance is very important for me. Of course, here the region being seen as a supranational identity. There we have various kinds, you might know of ASEAN, Southeast Asian Association. Then you have the AU, NAFTA, Mercosur. You have integration process beyond the nation, but not supranational. That's the difference. They are all intergovernmental, except Europe. The EU is the only one that, and Susanna can give you the details here. I worked within the Commission 30 years. I have some experience myself. Which competences are clearly supranational? Really, only at European level we have this. The others are all intergovernmental, the integration process at regional level. But with this intergovernmental limitations, you have even the non-interference in Southeast Asia. ASEAN has as a principle non-interference into other neighboring countries which are part of these, like now the problem with Myanmar. ASEAN does not intervene as such into issues. So the democracy within ASEAN is very difficult and it's very much national still. There's no way to interfere into the other nations' system, and if there are problems, that is quite different from the European approach. The Court of Justice was mentioned already by Catherine and others. There we have a European identity in the judicial system as well. All three powers, in the sense of Montesquieu, are at the European level, and this is very important. That's a supranationality. Beyond the nation, of course, we have what is very often called the multilateral system, that is very often the United Nations. And this, again, nomen est omen, already the UN, the nation says it's nation-based. If you look at the 193 different members of the United Nations in the General Assembly, they are all there because they are regarded and considered as nations by the UN. I will show you the example we have with COVID now, where a non-nation in the sense of the UN first alerted the WHO. If we had taken up this alert, this alarm coming at the time from Taipei, we could have saved millions of lives actually. But it was not done because all this is based on the nation. And then that is now my rather personal start to have a new understanding of what goes beyond the nation at the global level. I call that omnilateralism. That means omnibus or omnibus, going beyond the nation in the sense for all and by all. The idea is here that we have with the UN multi, that means many nations coming together, multilateral. But with omnilateral, we should have all, for all and by all. This is not only democratic, basically, it is all including people, as Arjan said already, in the sense of citizens directly being involved in one way or the other. It's very difficult to do that at the highest level of global governance. We go into details later, but here just to show you in the multi-level governance systems, this is the highest level, and this is the most difficult to be democratic in a direct sense. So let's see with the possibility at local level to have direct democracy, in my understanding, is rather easy, because you can have votes on about everything. If there should be in your neighborhood a theater or a swimming pool or a school, you can have a direct vote on that, a referendum, if you want to call it that way. A plebiscite is possible. There are direct interests involved here. So you know everything because it's in your neighborhood. You have the proximity of information. You don't need Zuckerberg with GAFA, with the various social media to inform you. This is really directly involving you. That's why you can have direct decision-making at local level. Direct democracy is possible at local level. And I said already, all politics is local. That's a very solid slogan which is practiced wherever in the world. And the other thing is that it's very important, if you have problems with the result of the voting or the decision-making in the village where you live, you can move out. There is a village B, in very simple terms. If you have a problem in village A, you just move aside and find probably in your neighborhood a swimming pool or school that you need in village B. This is possible. Imagine at global level. That's what Greta Thunberg says. There is no planet B. You cannot move out. If you have a problem at global level with the decision-making on climate change, for instance, if some nations are just realizing, it doesn't work that way, the decision in global governance at COP, for instance, is made, and they are not part of it. You cannot just move on. Maybe some rich people in the future, sooner or later, with the rockets go to the Mars, but in practical terms, there's no way to get out. There is no village B or planet B if you have global decision-making. So here, in global democracy, it's much more difficult. But the United Nations is still based on this principle of nations deciding by majority. The General Assembly, and much worse, as you know, the United Nations Security Council, is very much based on the possibility of a veto. Just to mention Ukraine again with Russia, how difficult this issue is very obvious. And here, again, it's enormous involvement. People are dying because of a veto. In very simple terms, there's no way for the United Nations to move as long as there's this possibility in the UNSC of a veto. So the representation idea of one person, one vote at global governance level is very difficult to translate into not only a majority. If you just imagine, we would have, theoretically, it's possible, you have a click with your mouse on certain issues worldwide, and at least those who have a computer, have an internet connection, we could vote on certain issues. The idea of climate change and what is done in Glasgow or next in Egypt could be voted on by everybody, at least who is technically capable to do so. But the results of that, would that be the best? Is that what we call the legitimacy of performance in a democracy? I personally have very much doubts about that, because the higher you get in the multi-level governance, the more expertise you need. You cannot really rely only on the majority of the people. Unfortunately, we all are not educated to that point. That's what we need. The higher we get in the multi-level system, you need more expertise, and I would say you need more civil society being involved. And civil society for more is very important here. And we see already at various levels, not only at the global level, it's the need for civil society, and Arjan, I think you called it more or less the citizen as such. It depends how you represent them. And for me, they are very important at the higher level of governance to come in directly with expertise and not only one person, one vote in the long term. So the first conclusion here on democracy is you can have different understanding, different forms of democracy at different levels. It's necessary even. You cannot have direct democracy at global level as well as on local level. And at local level, you don't need so much the so-called filtration of parliaments or representation. You can have direct democracy because it's very obvious what interests are involved. People are in their proximity to the decision-making already part of the whole society in the village or the whole decision-making process. They know about it. They don't need social media to understand issues of global governance at highest level, climate change and all these things, which are very expert-driven and very important as an impact on the world in the long term. So short-term interests in the local context could be voted on directly, but the long-term value system, and climate change for me is very much a value as well. It's not an interest simply of neighborhood or so. And these issues at highest level, global level, have to be dealt with everybody and if possible, with consensus decision making. So this is the first conclusion. The higher the level of governance, the more you need others involved than just direct voting systems. Why supranationality? And Susanna knows much better about that. I dare to use a word here, although I always try to avoid the idea of nationality in all contexts. So for me, I would rather call it global instead of supranational, but that's a more or less a linguistic issue here. Here we see the national level, of course, is always a sovereignty idea. That's what we still, unfortunately, even in the European context have. We are still thinking in the Westphalian system of 1648, you know, the Peace of Westphalia, where this idea of the nation was established more or less in Europe. And at the time, of course, religion was still very important. More or less, we overcame this in the sense of a state being separate from religion. This, at least, was already an enormous advance in that context. But we have, unfortunately, still this idea of sovereignty in many cases, and this translates even into wars, as we see in the neighborhood of the EU right now still. The region I mentioned already is intergovernmental still. That means the nation is still dominant here. Only the EU as supranational pooling sovereignty, and that's the idea. We talk about shared sovereignty in certain sectors of EU governance. And then I dare say this kind of sharing sovereignty is a stepping stone to global governance. And there I use the term now omnilateralism to go beyond just the multi of the nations. To give you concrete examples, let's look, for instance, at the pandemic we are living through, or hopefully finishing sooner or later if possible. It is very interesting because the word already, pandemos, concerns all people, pandemos, from Greek. And it was interesting, I give you the example, which I briefly mentioned, that there was a flight coming from Wuhan to Taipei at the end of 2019 already. And in Taipei, they checked people arriving for fever, and they realized they had a virus which they couldn't identify. There was a problem. And they sent immediately an email to the WHO in Geneva. But the problem was WHO is governed by nations. It's only based on nations. They could not take in the information even. And politically there was an issue because the head of the WHO was very much depending, when he was elected, by the Chinese. So the information they got from Taipei was not accepted by the WHO. That's why the announcement of a pandemic worldwide came very late. It could have started already weeks earlier. But unfortunately, the information, the official information, went through Beijing from Wuhan. And of course, in Beijing, it was suppressed for a while because they wanted to check that the image of China was really presented in a positive way, and it was really retarded, this information. And this was a big issue because it led to certain amounts of death and trillions of euro in damages of the economy in the long term. And we were not aware that could have been really shortened, these problems, from the very beginning if we would take in information from other sources than only nations. This is just one example where we have the United Nations with its basis on the nation state, a problem. Another problem we see here, I give this as an example of multi-level governance. At the EU level, we dealt with the pandemic because the EU as such, the Commission, was buying the vaccination material. And then it was distributed and allocated at local level. So we see here within the EU, at least between the regional and the local level, there's kind of communication and cooperation, which is very important in this case, for instance. But unfortunately, even within the EU, we had borders, still national borders drawn, which was not done. Some of you might remember there was a mad cow disease in the early 2000s. It was the first time where the EU realized you have to have clusters for certain issues beyond national borders. It was at the time between Germany and France in Alsace, the area which, after many wars back and forth, is still with a borderline. But there they realized that the cows were traded over the border so much they could not isolate along the borders. They had to see the whole area as one cluster of necessary insulation from the other parts of the EU. And this I proposed to some Green MEPs in Brussels why we shouldn't use this model even for the vaccination of human beings, and people were laughing. But in my understanding, that would be science-based politics, because it shows clearly that there are some issues which go beyond the border. You cannot draw the administration line there when you have issues like the virus or so crossing borders easily, and they should have common problems in this cluster beyond the border. But unfortunately, even Europe is still very much fixed on national borders within its own territory. So it's just to give this example here. But even in warfare, we see more and more so-called asymmetric wars. Here I give the example of Afghanistan, and I briefly put in parentheses here the issue of Ukraine. Where are the real borders of the nation? Ukraine as a nation has a very short history. I don't want to go into details. Probably there are some experts here who will correct me later on. But even there, the problem of finding the territory of the nation is not very clear always. And I show here Afghanistan, for instance, by NATO, and particularly by the Americans, of course, was taken as a nation in the sense of European homogeneity of the national identity and all that, which is not given in the history of Afghanistan at all. They are fiefdoms, and they were fighting and are now fighting amongst themselves. It's not you fight Afghanistan as such, it's you fight different parts of the country in different contexts. And this is very important to understand. That's what we call within Europe as well, with provinces and identities. Look at Scotland, Catalonia, I dare say even Bayern in Germany, or in Japan, Okinawa. You have these parts, or Philippines have these issues as well. You have these parts which claim even sovereignty. But I dare say there is no even nation that is really sovereign. North Korea is not sovereign. They depend on China to a high degree, not only economically, even politically. And this interdependence and globalization has gone so far that the nation with its sovereignty is an illusion. That's why I call the nation an historic aberration. We really did a mistake by putting the nation on the world through our colonizing powers from Europe onto Africa, Latin America, and so on. But I think I'm running out a little bit of time. So let me go to the second conclusion at least. There's no nation that is absolutely sovereign anywhere. And we need this governance at several levels to be through-going, not only in communication terms. So governance beyond the nation, of course, is beyond the regional integrations which were mentioned already. Now in Asia, it's quite interesting. There are lots of new ideas bringing the nations together in economic terms. And I mentioned already ASEAN. It's not supranational at all. They are all intergovernmental. But nevertheless, in economic terms, they see the need. And even Japan and China come together now in the RCEP and other contexts here. And we need this supra-regional, dare I say, idea of global governance more and more. Global governance, of course, we have, and that was mentioned briefly, the Group of Seven, the G20, we have the United Nations, we have WHO, parts of the so-called international, known as Orman, always a nation, organizations. And it's quite interesting, the ILO actually is an organization that has not only the nations as such in its decision-making, they have what we call in some languages tariff partners. That means the employees as well as the workers directly involved in decision-making. And they are independent from their nationality. This is the first, and the ILO actually dates back to the First World War. It's the oldest of these international organizations, and that's very interesting. They are much more open to this idea of stakeholder democracy, bringing in civil society, bringing in other factors than only the nation. But still, it's within the United Nations system, and the nation in the long term, at least there as well, is still very influential. Of course, you know the IMF, and now with COP, we see, and that's for me the example where omnilateralism is being more and more practiced, gradually at least, in the COP process, because there you have, with the conference of the parties and climate discussions, there you have the stakeholders, the NGOs, civil society, influential at a very high level, because they have the expertise. It's not the diplomats, and I was a diplomat myself for the EU in different countries. It's not the diplomats that decide. They decide formally, because it's still nation-based, but it's the influential impact of expertise from NGOs, civil society, that have the most impact in the long term. And this is very important to see that. So this is what I call omnibus, for all and by all, because the whole society, the people in plural, peoples are involved here. It's not only diplomats who have their limits in expertise, whereas with certain NGOs you have enormous expertise which is to be used in favor of good governance at global level. And I should hurry up a little bit, I'm afraid. Global governance, so we cannot do it by one person, one vote at global level, because then we would have the Chinese more or less decide for all of us. They are just too numerous with one person, one vote. And it's very difficult even to practice that. Of course, technically you could do it, so to have a computer with a click. But in practice, there have been done various models even of regions, how to quantify the vote. And this is the problem for me. We have to go from votes, which are quantified, to voices, which for me reflect quality, to convict others by the voice. And I mentioned here at the European Council, for instance, we have now about 80% of the decisions made by consensus. That's not a vote that somebody votes for Germany, Olaf Scholz, and Macron for France, and very often they go together at least, but there's Hungary, there's Poland, which very often are in opposition to the decisions. We have 80% of the council decision made in consensus. That means they come together. Of course, there's a give and take always involved, and very often it brings the black and white into a gray. But nevertheless, we have this possibility, and I feel this is what I call a stepping stone for global governance, reaching consensus at the highest level with expertise. But this is, in the long term, the aim we should see as the possibility for a democracy at global level. The issue at global level and higher level of democracy is always, here I mentioned it, the market-dependent media, the social media. And I personally have a big issue with social media. If you look at the possibility, for instance, that one person in the United States was able to decide that the President of the United States cannot address anymore through its technical means to address the people in a way. You know, the Twitter issue we had at the time when Trump was all of a sudden cut off. And this is enormous. How can somebody who managed in the market to reach a monopoly of communication stop the president, elected president of a country, to address the people? I think this is a public interest that shouldn't be just left to the market. But this is another issue discussing capitalism in other contexts. So at least we should be aware that at global level we depend very much on information through the media, particularly the so-called social media. So there is this move towards omnilateral governance, particularly on the issues of climate change. We see that with the COP that soon is coming up in Egypt. Glasgow was already with 12,000 voices from civil society, NGOs, representing very often the expertise which is necessary for these decisions at global level. So I should stop here. Thank you very much indeed, Gracia, and I'm open to discussing this. I just wanted to provoke you a little bit for interchanges we might have later on. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Wolfgang, for this big picture. And I think there is a lot to discuss, and I suppose that in these 2 days we won't just discuss in the room. Maybe we'll also discuss over the lunch or in the evenings. So there is plenty of time. And now I'm happy to give the floor to my colleague Amedeo Arena, full professor at University of Federico II in Naples. And as a supranational democracy needs a legitimacy and accountability of its own, I think justice has to be in the picture. And this brings us directly to the topic of the talk by Amedeo, who will explain us why the justice and the justice tool, and specifically, was a key in forging this supranational structure, which is the European Union. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Susanna, and first of all, congratulations on organizing a terrific event. I want to congratulate on that also for one reason, which is the choice of this particular hall, called Frederick II Hall, which happens to be the founder of the university where I have the honor of teaching. But I think this is just not a coincidence, it's particularly appropriate. First of all, because when he established the university on the 5th of June, 1224, he wanted the university for many, not for the few. And I guess the relationship between the few and the many is very much the topic of today's and tomorrow's event. And second, because he wanted to establish what nowadays we would call the European university. He didn't just want to establish a university for his own kingdom, of which Apulia was a part, of course, but for whole Europe. And this is clear from his letter from Lodi in 1239, where he invited students from other parts of Italy to attend the studium in Naples, and also ultramontanos, students from beyond the Alps. So free movement of students, in a way. So today, and also I want to congratulate Susanna for the choice of this particular panel called the Seeds of Supernationality. And in order to get into this particular topic, I'd like to have a look at what happened across the ocean. So there, the supranational, or should I say the federal turn, has a clear date, 1787, where the Constitution was approved, and it contained a very important clause, the Supremacy Clause, according to which the Constitution and the laws of the US shall be the supreme law of the land. I think we've all heard this part. And the judges in every state shall be bound thereby, anything in the Constitution or the laws of any state to the contrary notwithstanding. So there are at least two separate important legal issues here. One is, of course, the supremacy of federal law vis-à-vis state law, but the other is also the fact that federal law is also binding within the states, the individual state. So there was a turn from law between the 13 colonies to a kind of law that also applies within the states. So when did something like that happen in Europe? Well, the seeds of supranationality, of course, were already planted in the Schuman Declaration, where we can read that the high authority's decision will be enforceable in France and Germany and other member countries, and appropriate measures will be provided for means of appeal against the decisions of the authority. So the idea that they should be applicable also within the member states. And of course, this was translated in the Treaty of Paris, establishing the European coal and steel community. Well, we have a number of pretty supranational provisions, and this was indeed the spirit of that organization. So think about the infringement procedure. We all hear about the infringement procedure. Well, not only it had sanctions, but it had pretty modern sanctions. Indeed, member states failing to comply with their obligations could be subject to the suspensions of funds from the ECEC. So it's something extremely modern if we compare that to the conditionality regulation that was adopted very recently and is now being implemented with some difficulty against some particular member state which might have failed to comply with some founding values of the Union, such as the rule of law. And then we have another provision, Article 41 of the Treaty of Paris, establishing the preliminary ruling procedure. It was very different from what we are used to nowadays. It enabled courts, national courts, to refer to the Court of Justice matters concerning the validity of community law. So some may claim that this was a rather unsuccessful provision, considering that it was used 5 times in 50 years. But another way of looking at it is that it was particularly successful in ensuring the exclusive competence of the Court of Justice to rule on the validity of community law, thus preventing member states' court from challenging the validity of community law. And in this respect, it has been quite successful. Then we all know what happened, the failure of the European defense community. So we had a reboot of the European integration process on less supranational roots. And indeed, the EEC infringement procedure, Article 171, was toothless, so to speak. So in case an infringement of EEC law was established, even by the Court of Justice, well, that judgment would only certify that infringement. There were no sanctions. There was no state liability. Sanctions would only be introduced several years later with the Treaty of Maastricht. We have to wait for the 90s for sanctions to be implemented. And what about the preliminary ruling procedure under Article 177? Well, that didn't look very supranational at all. First of all, we do no longer have a clear statement of the exclusive competence of the Court of Justice to rule on the validity of community acts. And also, we have a provision that enables the Court of Justice to rule on the interpretation of community law. So, doesn't sound very supranational, looks like a judicial cooperation instrument. Or maybe not, because some supranational seeds had been planted a few years earlier by a notable Apulian, Nicola Catalano. So if indeed we look at the next slide, okay, the draft that Catalano had prepared on the 13th of December 1956 in the course of the Val d'Uixelles negotiations, well, he envisaged the preliminary ruling as a procedure that would enable the Court of Justice to rule not only on the validity, but also the interpretation and the application of community law within the member states. Application that gives us a hint that the preliminary ruling indeed could be used as a judicial review tool, so as a tool for the Court of Justice to rule on the compatibility of national law against community law. And in case this one word is not evidence enough, I think we can refer to what was Catalano's source of inspiration in drafting this provision. And there was the Italian preliminary question of constitutionality, which had been introduced in 1948, but in fact it only became operational a few months earlier. Indeed, the first judgments of the Court of Justice, of the Italian Constitutional Court, were handed down in the middle of 1956, so just a few months before Catalano's draft. And the Italian question, the preliminary question of constitutionality, is not a judicial cooperation tool by itself. It is a judicial review tool, enabling the Italian Constitutional Court to strike down laws that are contrary to the Italian Constitution. So if that was the source of inspiration, I think it's possible to hypothesize that Catalano had thought that the preliminary ruling procedure could be used by the Court of Justice to rule on the compatibility between national laws and community law. So these seeds had been planted, they blossomed a few years afterwards. And the first sign, the first leaf that came out was the Van Gendenlos case, where what happened there, essentially, the Netherlands authority had raised custom duties, and so the issue, contrary to Article 12 of the EEC Treaty, so the issue arose whether the prohibition on member states to raise their custom duties could give rise to a right that individual companies, importers, could enforce before national courts. And of course, this matter was referred to the Court of Justice via preliminary ruling procedure, but the governments of certain member states objected that this had to do with the application of community law within individual member states, which was an issue for the constitutional law of the Netherlands. But there is a very interesting memo here by Michel Godet. He was the head of the legal service of the European executives, which so essentially what we now would refer to as the legal service of the European Commission. And he happened to be another member of the drafting committee along with Catalano. So the two had something in common, apparently. And he argued that while under normal, common, ordinary international treaties, their effects within the legal systems of the parties were pretty much left to the decision of the parties, this could not work for the European integration process, because the effects of the treaties within the member states were a matter of interpretation of the treaties, a matter for the Court of Justice to adjudicate on. And indeed, this was the ruling that the Court of Justice gave in '63. So the court took the view that it was not asked to adjudicate upon the application of the treaty, but only to interpret the Treaty of Rome within the context of community law with reference to its effects on individuals. So, and of course, we know what the court ruled regarding the effects of community law within the member states. The court ruled that independently of the legislation of member states, community law not only imposes obligations on individuals, but also is intended to confer upon them rights which become part of their legal heritage. So community law creates rights that we all, as individuals, can enforce before national courts. However, that was only part of the supranational development process, because what happened in member states that, unlike the Netherlands, did not autonomously and unilaterally recognize the internal primacy of treaty provisions that were directly enforceable, as in the Netherlands. Well, that case arose in Italy in between the end of 1962 and the beginning of 1964. So Italy nationalized at the end of 1962 the production and distribution of electricity. And some believed that this measure could be at odds with 4 provisions of the Treaty of Rome. So the issue was raised before the Giudice Conciliatore of Milan, Small Claims Court of Milan, which referred an order to the Court of Justice that happened on the 16th of January 1964. And of course, someone from the Italian government, that was Riccardo Monaco, who ironically would later become a judge, the Italian judge at the European Court of Justice. He objected that, again, the reference was inadmissible because essentially by the Court of Milan was asking the Court of Justice to rule on the compatibility between Italian law and community law, and that again was an issue of application of community law in the member states rather than one of interpretation. But the Court of Justice again found the reference to be admissible and claimed that it was supposed to give a decision not on the validity of Italian law in relation to the treaty, but only on the interpretation of those articles, the articles of the Treaty of Rome, in the context of the points of law stated by the Giudice Conciliatore. And of course, we all know what the judgment of the 15th of July 1964 was. The court ruled that the Article 177, so the very provision on the preliminary ruling, had to be applied regardless of any domestic law whenever questions relating to the interpretation of the treaties often arise. And this paved the way to integration through law. Indeed, a number of preliminary references were made to the Court of Justice, and that has enabled the Court of Justice really to advance European integration by setting out a number of important principles. Think about the principle of state liability on Frankovic, or something which now we might be more familiar, especially if the pandemic is fading out, the right to receive monetary compensation in case our flights are late. That again arose from a preliminary ruling. Of course, fundamental rights, again arising from a preliminary ruling. How was that possible? Well, some scholars claim that it was a tale of judicial empowerment. Essentially, national courts saw in the preliminary ruling an opportunity to engage with the Court of Justice and also to taste the forbidden fruit of judicial review of legislation, which is something that in some countries, such as Italy and Germany, was meant to be reserved for the Constitutional Court only. But I think there is another side to that story, and there's been a very interesting book by a scholar called Tom Pavone on this, according to which an important part was also played by lawyers. which kind of acted as ghostwriters in some cases. Indeed, they sometimes constructed cases and suggested, in their pleadings, they even provided suggestions as to what the preliminary references to the Court of Justice could be, and that gave the opportunity to the Court of Justice to advance European integration. That, of course, was the case of Costa Enel. So this is Gian Galeazzo Stendardi, a scholar of constitutional law and community law from Milan, who in 1958, he theorized primacy of community law with this argument that the community would be quite meaningless if its institutions could see their acts nullified by unilateral measures of the states taking precedence over community law. That was his book in 1958. So he launched proceedings on behalf of Costa before the Small Claims Court of Milan, obtained this reference of the 16th of January 1964. Incidentally, that was the very first reference by an Italian court to the Court of Justice. And he obtained a judgment by the Court of Justice of the 15th of July 1964 that not only upheld his views on primacy, but that almost used words for words his treatise of 1958. Indeed, the court ruled that the effectiveness of regulations would be quite meaningless if a state could unilaterally nullify its effects by means of legislative measures which could prevail over community law. By the way, I have it on record that Stendardi's book was available at the Library of the Court of Justice when the judgment was handed down, so of course. Finally, what should we think about the legitimacy of this process? Well, I think I read a very interesting paper by Daniel Halberstam at University of Michigan, claiming that if we're looking for legitimacy, we shouldn't look for something like the Philadelphia Convention, because it is essentially left to each of us by defending our own rights and enabling reference to be made to the Court of Justice, we contribute to the legitimacy of the process and to the making of community law. So to paraphrase the French version of Voyering, the struggle for law, qui défend son droit, défend le droit européen tout entier. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Amadeo. It was really enlightening. Now I have the pleasure to invite here Simona Ciullo, in representative of the Federalist movement in Apulia, who has a message from the Apulian Federalists.
Thanks. Good morning. I express my compliments to all them of rights of European Union and international right to Unisalento for the organization of edition of the Supranational Democracy Dialogue this year, and in particular in this edition in displaying the location of Svevo Castle in Brindisi. I want to thank Prof. Susanna Cafaro for invitation to participation to the meeting of the European Federalist Movement, of which I am Secretary for Puglia. I wanted to give welcome to effort and participants. Well, with the war in Ukraine, we are assisting to fall manifestation of crisis of international order after the fall URSS. United States, up to now, represents the winners of Cold War, forming a new liberal order in the world. Nevertheless, China and India are now affirming their power as a superpowers in the economic world power, and Russia in an energy field. In these countries, there is not a policy based on the democratic fully values and the defense of human rights. In this scenery, European Union is placed as a union of divided countries, and because of this, with a defense international policy divided and disunited. In this scenery, national interests are in contrast with the realization of a supranational democracy, supporting really a self-governing and myopic government. It's necessary to build a new political order and go on with urgent institutional and political laws in many sectors of Italian, European, and world governments. This is the real challenge. European Union must create a democratic government. In this process, it's a fundamental the role of civil society to democratize the European project. The European Federalist Movement proposed a new European international model as a peace and progress model with the creation of a European Federation. Among the most important purposes of MFA then is the sovereignty of Europe in those fields in which national politics don't seize it anymore. Because sovereignty is tied to the power of action, it's necessary to afford the problem of making it available for inside and outside politics. That European countries must follow in a united way, they defend their value and interest. So it's important to give a reform of treaties to the countries in order to overcome the actual subordination of working of European Union to the willing of political decision of the European states. In this view, the most important reform is the attribution of a physical power to European Union, which must call directly resources and spend them in the general interest. So we must join to common decision with the Council attributed to the European Parliament, so that to impose European taxes on citizens and enterprise of European Union. We deal with a reform which must be open to treaties, oriented to strengthen the EU competence and the decision with the full complete decision of European Parliament, and with the abolition of the unit vote, the Council and the national proposal, vetoes. International Conference of the Future of Europe represents an important way to European integration on the basis of the Citizens' Agreement, free to participate to the great political decision to fulfill their destiny. The conferences represent not only a precious instrument leading to the European project, but also to a new way to implement democracy with rivals, in which we will be called to ask to yourself how we feel European citizens. In which way? After 70 years from Schuman Declaration and under the problem of pandemia and the Ukraine war, it's evident that all of us must think again to European Union in a different way. The conferences represent the key to obtain very soon the reform in federal sense of European Union. Like European Federalist Movement admits since long time to answer to the challenge that we afford inside and outside the border of European states. Above all, we must answer the problem of international politics, immigration and security. To find agreement between 27 countries in very difficult and very delicate and complex problem. It's necessary to reform the Lisbon Treaty, cancelling every power of veto, on a very rigid intergovernmental method giving to Parliament an essential rule. The European Federalist Movement in Puglia is necessary to conference, and it's also an occasion to relaunch the realization of European macro region of Mediterranean countries. And thanks also to next generation EU investments, thanks to recovery plan in the field of the energy and the digitalization, we can indeed fulfill new infrastructure to permit to wide speed in whole Europe, and in particular in the south of Italy, and also to connect Italy to Africa, affirming the essential role of Italy. This new national and European policy will give clear advantage to movement of vehicles and people, new entries to economic production in very economic sector, opening to new strategic and strong dialogue with the people for way, who still alive new political and economic settlements which create migration also in a legal way. Italy, thanks to its central strategic position, can develop our role of link between old countries and Africa. It's essential the rule of a city society, not only for democracy into the European project, but also as model of world governments, which is based for future on respect and the strategy of the person, on sustainable development and the importance of human rights, of solidarity and peace, the only aim of the human destiny. Thanks for the attention.
Thank you, Simona. Now, I have a video to share because for technical reasons, we were not able to provide streaming and so remote contributions, and I received some videos to share. But before, I would like to ask if there are comments or questions, because we have 15 minutes left, and we can also use them to collect some other voices on the topic of this first session. So if anybody wants to say something, please raise your hand. Please, Wolfgang.
They have a social function, monarchies, yes, but you don't need to give them a political one. So we would look, and I really like the reference that you already gave to Africa. We need to have these dialogues from everywhere. In Africa, you have plenty of monarchies that play a social role. They have a cultural role, they have a society role, and they are embedded in a republic. So there is no, in that sense, there is no contradiction, and you can host your monarchy in a republic if you want. But this is within a republic something that you decide together. Wolfgang doesn't agree. We should continue the dialogue.
May I also add something here? It is not well known, but both Flaminio Costa and Gian Galeazzo Stendardi were monarchists. So they significantly contributed to the history of Europe as we know today, and they were monarchists. In particular, Stendardi theorized this point. So in his opinion, even the fact that the European Parliament was not directly elected at that particular stage was not the end of the process, of the European integration process, because the process was ensured by enabling individuals to have a direct right of action, and so through their legal proceedings to contribute to the European integration process. So this is why I think we should take into account both aspects, not only the classic understanding of democracy as someone based on elections of representative bodies within the European level, but also the individual rights of action and the way they contribute to the European integration process, also through judicial proceedings. So I think there is a greater layer of complexity there.
Yes, there is a raised hand there. Please, Catherine. Dovrebbe essere acceso.
Okay, I had two questions, if I may. I had a question for Mr. Pape about the dilemma of civil society and expertise. How do you, it's an open question if we have to enrich representative democracy, where does the legitimacy of expressing part of the common opinion or reactions. How do you define the legitimacy of these two sources? And the other question I had, which may be a big one, if I may, about the primacy of EU law, could we get a compact judgment on the position of the Polish judicial system? I know it's a big question. I had some reading on that, but I would be very interested in having a quick opinion. Sorry.
No, thank you very much for that question, Catherine. I think we discussed it briefly already amongst the two of us bilaterally, but you're right. The issue really is how to bring in other stakeholders than the formal nation-based decision-making. And here we have that at European level, but even at national level already, how much civil society can influence political decisions. What is the legitimacy of the stakeholder? How do you select them? And I was at the time in Brussels in the so-called governance team preparing for the referendum, the constitutional treaty we had on our mind before the French, and sorry to say the French, and the Dutch opposed that. And there we had the issue already. Pascal Lamy, some people might remember him as the WTO Secretary General at the time. He was my boss, and he clearly wanted us to find ways how to find some system of accreditation for stakeholders, civil society representative. That's very difficult because they are very heterogeneous. They're completely diverse. They're a single person sometimes who have the money to represent a certain interest. Remember George Soros, for instance, his enormous influence because he made in a very short period of time a lot of money, and he is politically very influential. That all the way to Hungary, Orban and all these stories behind him, the university he created, he has to withdraw from Hungary now. And there are others who are really democratically elected within their system as representatives of a group, some like, Greenpeace, whatever. Greenpeace, for instance, is almost a commercial institution worldwide now. And they are very diverse, these groups. And to find some kind of criteria for accreditation is very difficult. But you have this already in the European system with the not only the regional consultative bodies, but as well the, what is it called, ESCE, again, the Economic and Social Committee, for instance. There you have a system of accreditation already. And it's very difficult to select who can speak up, who is representative. But among academics, for instance, you have a certain expertise which people know each other. And I admit there are sometimes even collusions. We come together here because we know Susanna sometimes, you know. Sorry to be so direct here, but it's obvious. These are problems of human relations coming in here as well. The objective criteria for expertise or for representing NGOs is very difficult to find, but it's done already at the so-called ECOSOC at the United Nations level. There as well, you have certain NGOs, and I'm working with the Japanese NGO, the Peace Boat, which is accredited to the United Nations as a civil society representative, although they have no particular representative expertise, but nevertheless, they are rather political. For instance, they went with a peace boat and they go around the world with this boat, just to remind you of the real activity of this group. And they couldn't go to the United Nations and the United States because it's in New York, because they had Fidel Castro once on the boat. But I thought that is very interesting to see a little bit the other side of some aspects of the world. But you are right, it's very difficult to have this choice. And there I would say, when you use the word legitimacy, there are two ways. There's a justice legitimacy, which is a formal nation state still for us, and there's a so-called performance legitimacy. And that would bring us into this discussion, for instance, how is China so successful? A lot of people say China has a performance legitimacy because it brought hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. And this gives them the legitimacy for this government. And if you look into China, President Xi is more popular than anybody else as a president in the world. He has about 80% of the people of China behind him because he is successful in his performance, apparently. And that's very interesting. It's not the Chinese data. It's the Pew system, the Americans who found out in China how popular he actually is. I don't know if this performance legitimacy as an alternative here is strong as an argument. I'm myself as well a Democrat, but nevertheless we have to be aware there are certain system competitions now and some other systems are quite successful. But thanks for the question. Sorry to talk.
Do you want to talk about the Poland case, Amedeo, I suppose? Yeah.
Well, probably would take a whole afternoon. What I can say is that the rule of law, I think, provides a perfect illustration while traditional categories of democracy and legitimacy have to be rethought in view of country affairs. We should not forget that there are democratically elected governments that are currently undermining the rule of law. And in Italy, it was a democratically elected government that passed the racial laws. We should never forget that. So while and also that's another opportunity to rethink of the traditional decision-making procedures. The Council has been deadlocked on that for years, given the very high majority required by Article 7. So who has really done something in these years about the rule of law crisis? Well, I would say the Court of Justice and the Commission. The Court of Justice, even with one order, managed to enable some Polish judges that had been illegally dismissed to be reinstated. With another order, has issued a fine of 1 million euros per day, and that probably is going to do something. And also the European Commission and it has enabled with other judgments, even delivered in different contexts concerning, for example, the Portuguese judgments or the Republica judgment concerning Malta, for example, has provided the legal basis for the Commission to launch infringement proceedings that could be a game changer. And finally, the Court of Justice that with this recent ruling confirmed and upheld the validity of the conditionality regulation. So again, we really have to see how this plays out, but it seems that judicial proceedings are going to have a very important role to play in ensuring democracy and the rule of law of Europe, even in our current times. Thank you.
Thank you, Amedeo. Me too, I would like to add something on these topics raised in the last questions. First of all, about something about terminology, who Wolfgang said. So why supra instead of international? And this is also, I think, an occasion to specify why we decided to call this event supranational democracy. Because the difference is having an authority over the states, which has an authority not only over the states, but over the citizens, and a direct relation with the citizens. Because what is over the states has to prove in some way both effective and legitimate. Otherwise, the states wouldn't relinquish their powers. So the basic features of whatever is supra is having some kind of legitimacy and some kind of accountability, and the willing states to share their sovereignty. So it's not such an easy choice for a state to relinquish some sovereignty. So you need some minimum qualities, let's say, and these qualities may increase or may improve over time. I agree on some things that Ariane said about the European Council, which is not so much democratic. I agree with you, and but also I disagree about the Parliament, because I think the Parliament made quite an evolution in taking legislative powers, and I think that the Commission made quite an evolution in becoming more and more a government. Because the way the Parliament select the commissioners became more effective along the way. And now it has a real final word on single commissioners. We saw candidate commissioners resign because they didn't get the approval of the Parliament, which is making them more and more similar to a government. Also the fact that they are chosen according to the results of the European elections, because otherwise the Parliament would never approve them. So the system is evolving, and of course there is still way to go. I agree, there is still way to go. And the other tricky thing is about civil society. I agree, civil society is not by definition democratic. There are democratic association, less democratic association, which are not associations, are more like companies or even state companies sometimes. So I see two possible solutions. One possible solution is having requirements for civil society, for association, in order to be part of this discourse, this political discourse. The alternative, which is maybe more practical, is having lots of associations, lots of civil society. Like in the ECOSOC, now there are more than 1,600, which is so in the number you can at least bet that at least half of them may be quite democratic. And for instance, the World Bank has started a few years ago a sort of election of representatives of civil society by civil society. So once they just had an internal office dealing with civil society, after they moved to having some representative of civil society as an interlocution, and these people are elected by all the other associations they deal with. So having attended for some time the Civil Society Policy Forum of the World Bank, I was invited to vote for a candidate, yes, which is interesting. And so there are here and there some experiments going on about how we reduce this magma of civil society in something you can talk to, which is another challenge at global level. So before we go for lunch, I don't know if it's already time. I don't know if we want to start the following session with the video or put with the video now. Okay, so this is the first of a comment, Francesco? Yes, okay. We were wondering why Francesco was still silent.
No, but I'm aware that. Okay. No, I'm aware that the time is.
Don't
tyrant.
worry.
No. I just want to have a comment from all the panelists. First of all, thank them for really, really interesting inputs, and I want to be a bit provocative, linking what you said of this omnilateral system and what you express with this linguistic approach, European approach. So I would like to ask, and whether is it possible in your system you design for the future, this global governance, to apply the European linguistic approach, whether it's going to be too expensive or we can apply a sort of lingua franca, no? Not going behind the Esperanto style of this. So this is one. Second, for the professor, whether also a bit provocative, is it possible to apply in the international sphere a possible integration? I know it's not the same, you have to look at different level, but this preliminary, if there in the International Court of Justice you see some seeds of preliminary reference and supranational, and so European system again in the International Court of Justice, and whether we need better educated judge, citizen or lawyers for granting rights, and because I lived in the Netherlands and I have a question. But I'm wondering whether the Netherlands will be more supranational after Ruth. I mean, it's a bit, too much. No, whether... No, how can we move then from the threat of national elections in Europe? I saw a proposal from this panel of citizens that we should vote in Europe in the same day, 9th of May. I saw the proposal, right? I don't know, what should we do, like more than that? Because every time, me personally, but maybe it's my problem, I didn't sleep during the election day in France because of my personal, but it's my problem probably. So, thank you very much, everyone.
So, very fast round of answers.
First on the languages. Of course, we have the model in Europe, at the moment 24 official languages. And I was writing laws in the EU, for the EU, when I was with the anti-dumping team. We have this, and the most difficult thing to work out is different versions in different languages of laws. It's very complicated. We have particular professionals for that, who are so-called jury linguists, and they are lawyers with knowledge of different languages. They are very specialized, and I think they're highest paid interpreters I know, at least. But the problem here is really the differences of cultures expressed by the languages, in my understanding at least. It's interesting, at the United Nations we have 6 official languages. We have 24 at the EU, but ASEAN has only 1. And the interesting part is this is an outside language, and it's neutral, because it's English for them. They have all their, even the charter as such is done in English only. They have translations into other language to make it understood by the people, but the official documents are in English for the ASEAN Southeast Asian Association. That's very interesting because it's an outside language. It's neutral in so far. But this is very difficult to do at global level, of course. And I personally feel we are moving anyway to more visualization, because I realize from my experience in Japan and China in particular that we are more objective using symbols. In very simple terms, if you drive on the street, you know exactly the triangle, what it means, and things like that. It's much faster, the intake of visualization. That's why I use slides. I had to use words, unfortunately, in Roman letters, which is not that fast. But using symbols, for me, is very important. And I couldn't explain it now anymore. For instance, the understanding of the nation. They have the Chinese and Japanese, a common symbol for the nation. It's very interesting. It's still the king in a kind of circle. That means is still very much centralized in that understanding. For federalists, it would be very difficult to use this symbol, for instance, for the nation as such. And things like that are expressed through symbols. And we are moving as well. If you look, particularly with young people on the phone, how they use their smartphone, the symbols are becoming more and more the main communication. It's much faster, and the intake is much faster for us as well. So in the long term, I guess, even treaties might be done in symbols. That would be my solution in the long term. I'm too old to say the long term here, but nevertheless. Thank you.
Catherine, do you want to add something? No?
All right, I'll take up the last part of your question. So do we need better educated citizens, lawyers, or judges? We need all 3. And again, I think Costa Enel provides an illustration of that. So on the one hand, it seems like a tale of 2 individuals, Costa and Standardi, that changed European history single-handedly. Well, that's how it looks like, but it wasn't like that. So civil society had a very important role to play. FIDE passed a resolution, a unanimous resolution on primacy of community law before the judgment. And by the way, that was drafted by Nicola Catalano, notable Apulian. And nowadays, there are a number of civil society organizations that promote strategic litigation. This is a growing trend in European studies called legal mobilization. For example, I'm proud to be a member of one called L'Altro Diritto, that is strongly committed to ending discrimination on the basis of nationality. In Italy, we still have some decrees from 1994 that reserve to Italian citizens certain position in the public service, many of which of these reservations are clearly contrary to free movement of people, free movement of workers, namely because the exception is interpreted by the Court of Justice much narrower than the reservation laid down by Italian law. So it is many times thanks to this organization that these kinds of strategic litigation instances take place. So we absolutely need that, and of course, so we need, and this organization, they are key to linking lawyers that are aware of this mechanism and citizens that need to be aware of their rights. And of course, judges, they're absolutely essential. So how does it come that a giudice conciliatore has more claim Judge of Milan makes a preliminary reference in 1964, the first ever. By the way, the Giudice Conciliatore of Milan had made its first reference to the Constitutional Court, again in another part of the Costa Enel saga. There was Judge Carones, and it was the very first Italian constitutional reference made by that particular judge. And well, possibly that is again that is possible thanks to the education in European Union law of judges. And in this respect, I'm proud to say that the Italians, especially the Scuola Superiore della Magistratura in Italian, is very good at it. So I had the pleasure of teaching one of those seminars called IACOS for judges, and it is amazing because you have the opportunity to really discuss issues such as the rule of law crisis in Europe with judges from the different member states. And also judges now, they go to different member states to see how justice is administered there. They spend times at the Court of Justice, and I think this is absolutely essential because if judges are the gatekeepers in the preliminary procedure in access to justice, well, they need to be aware of the functioning of the system. So with all three elements combined, I think we can have, let's say, this can pave the way to further integration in the European continent. Thank you.
Your question about Rutte, yeah, but I think it will have to wait until after Rutte, because indeed with this government, and we just have a new government of Rutte in the Netherlands, no, it will not be that supranational, that's for sure. I mean, the Prime Minister has been looking at Europe and managing it from what we say the Netherlands corporate. So it has been the corporate business of the Netherlands that has had a fantastic deal out of Europe. And there is a new government. In the government treaty or the agreement, there seems to be a slight shift. Monday is really speech day. Vlad is speeching in Moscow. I think Macron is speeching in Strasbourg. Wopke Hoekstra, that finance minister, now foreign minister, who manages to insult and shock everyone in Europe, he will be speaking and explaining that new stance of the Netherlands towards Europe, where it wants to lead, it wants to be progressive. You understand that after 12 years of Rutte, we really first want to see, and then we will believe. But that's after Monday. In terms of those elections, yeah, I heard already quite a bit of feedback towards what I said about, yes, but the glass is half full. Indeed, the glass is half full in Europe. In terms of supranational democracy. I've been talking about what's next. I've been talking about the full glass of fantastic wine that we want to hand over and deliver to our children for them to bring. If I take you to that European Republic in the distance, indeed, you know, the way we see it, it should be that region based on regions. Your 50, 60, 70 regions where we have our own identity, but we are protected by that roof of that European Republic, in which indeed we would directly vote for supranational. That's also the proposal that was adopted last week. Supranational lists on the one hand, so you all represent or vote for your representatives in the European Parliament. There will also be a Senate where you vote basically two representatives per region, for example, into a Senate. So both that region, your own identity, where you come from, will be represented at that level, and also politically, the flavor where you come from, but supranationally, it will be represented there. Do we do that on the same day? Yes, that does make sense indeed. So going there, that's the picture ahead.
Conversation. I think the video will be for the next session because there is lunch waiting for us, and so see you outside under the how do we say, the passage to go outside. Thank you, everybody.